So that I've been reflecting still on Philip Wallach's space with us, and I had two thoughts. One is, okay, just because at the founding, representatives were kind of special status individuals, and that was the intention, does not mean that needs to be the case today. I think especially with the access to information that the average person has, like going to schools or being born in certain circles just is not necessary. And I think there are thousands of stories of representatives coming from very humble beginnings and doing incredible things. And there are people with tremendous influence who are kind of atypical characters. And so I think that the more I thought about that, the more uncomfortable I am with that in the House of Representatives. I really do think we should have, welders who want to study how to govern and help govern. I think
Well,
that would be helpful.
I think the difference here is I think the idea is you don't you don't have to be part of the political establishment. You don't have to be a lawyer to be a representative in the House. And but it doesn't mean that you don't need to know certain things, right? Like you
Right.
need some sort of background. Like the mechanic who on the weekend is reading John Locke, that guy is probably better prepared to be a representative in the House than a lawyer in all honesty, because he is connected to two different worlds, which is kind
Yeah.
of the point, right?
Right.
And I think that overall, the biggest problem we have in the House with the concentration of power and the limited number of opportunities there is to get power is that you end up with a whole bunch of lawyers. You end up with a whole bunch of people in the same world. And the whole idea of the House is to represent all the different interests and factions of this very large republic that we have.
Yeah, and I think principally what we have are people whose primary motive is greed, and lawyers being chief amongst those.
As the just for reference, Walter is a lawyer.
Yeah.
I hate to call him out like that right now, but
No, it's. I mean, I know the people. I'm a lawyer who very much doesn't get along with many lawyers, and what's interesting. I mean, another piece of this, right, is look at the cost of higher education today compared to at our founding, or even 50 years ago. As a percentage of the average income, it's like quintupled. And so most people who graduate from law school are basically wage slaves or debt slaves, right? They are, indebted to the system. And so they basically have to um, do, unsavory things to pay back their debt. Um, how are my levels now, Jeff?
it's a little loud.
Okay.
I don't know if it's you or if it's me. Like I turned down the volume on my headphones, but it's not changing. So I asked if you
Okay.
turned down your mic. That
So,
sounds
well,
better.
I'm able to turn it down. So,
Okay.
I have done that.
Okay. It
Um,
sounds much better now.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I'm just a loud guy. Sorry, guys. This is part of being a lawyer. I like project by nature. Um, the but I really do think it's the case that like going to undergrad or to law school, it makes a person just more likely to essentially they're forced to buy into the present system and don't have the time or the opportunity really to think about or attempt to change it. It does take kind of either you're just bought into continuing with the same, or you're not really interested.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's true for a lot of things, and I think it is that way in politics. I think there are a lot of people who get into politics thinking that they are going to change what happens. And then they discover that there really is only one real path to power, and that is to bend the knee to different institutions or people or wealth, to raise a lot of money, to I don't want to say manipulate, but capture people's attention rather than educate them and get to power. And then once you do all of those things, you have to continue to do them to stay in power. And the thing that gets forgotten is the purpose of why you were there in the first place. Now it just becomes about doing this thing over and over and over again, because eventually you'll get to solving that problem. But I think, as we've seen, problems just aren't getting solved. They're trapped. They're trapped in a system. There's been so many congressional representatives that have retired after short times in the House over the past 10 years, and a lot of their stories are the same. They're like, it's miserable. Like, you have to constantly raise money. Like, nobody listens. Nobody has honest debate. Like, what's the point of being here? And I think, like, that's, like, the thing. And it's okay, well, clearly the environment's broken. How do we fix the environment?
Right. Yeah, and I think that so this goes to my second point, which is Philip Wallach stated, it's neither necessary nor sufficient to uncap the House to fix representation in America. And I think he is indubitably wrong on at least one of those points. It is necessary to uncap the House to fix representation, because fixing the way that committees work doesn't change the fact that a member of the House of Representatives is going to have to spend most of their time campaigning so that they can stay in the office to potentially get an opportunity to maybe get a bill that they think might be of interest through committee, right? It doesn't change the fundamental problems with representation, which is they aren't being educated by their constituents, and they're not educating their constituents because they don't have to, because the only people that they need to please is the donor class.
Well, and that feeds into, because we asked Philip earlier in the show, what is the responsibility of a congressional representative? And you've heard me say over time, to make it as simple as possible for people, your congressional representative's job is to listen and inform. And that's essentially what Philip said as well, right? So, like, we have the same basic understanding of what the job is. And I'm kind of with you. I don't understand how he says it's not necessary, right? Like, if to improve representation, which is something that he wants to do as well as we want to do, and we might just have different ideas of how to do it. I can't fathom how you improve representation without actually adding people to represent.
And to his credit, I do think he came around on this a little bit, right? I said, well, I don't think, or I think that the possibility of making the rule change on the committee bill idea that he had is much more likely if you uncap the House. And he's like, oh, you might be right, right? So, I don't think he said that in kind of towards the beginning of the show, and so maybe we convinced him, and maybe we should send him this video and say, hey, Philip, you want to come back on the show, and let's continue the debate. We really do think uncapping the House is necessary to finish representation. And I think the other thing I would love to do with him is, and I have the book that he recommended from the 60s on the something on representation, the quality of representation. I'm going to read that book, and I want to bring him back, and I want to try to define representation with him, and then I want to talk about whether or not he still believes that uncapping the House is not necessary to restore representation in America.
No, I would love to do that. And I reached out to a few of our listeners from the last space, and more than one of them told me that they also want to read that book. And so I think we should all read the book and then have Philip back on the show and then talk about that. That would be fantastic.
Yeah.
What is the name of the book?
Well, it's on its way to my door. I think it's arriving today. And so let me just go look them up
from Amazon.
Mr. Bezos is getting married. In other news, congratulations to him. The Concept of Representation by Hannah F. Pitkin, Pitkin, written in 1972 or published in 1972.
So that's a woman, right?
Yes, I think. I don't know.
I find that very unique, and for two reasons. Because there's another book over here I have. All right, it's not at my fingertips.
Yes, it is a woman.
Okay, so I have another book. It's on the history of the House of Representation or Representatives. It was written in the early 1900s, and it's basically a 100-year history of the House, and it's also written by a woman. And it's strange to me because there were so few women back then that, I mean, the 60s is a little bit different, but in the early 1900s that were really like capable or interested in doing some of this work. So it's interesting that there are two women that have written what I would consider, at least with one, a very pivotal book on the House of Representatives and representation. And I'm sure that this one is just as important, even though I haven't read it based on Philip's recommendation.
So she has passed away. She was born in Berlin, immigrated to the U.S. in 1938 at the age of 7. Her family fled Nazi Germany for Oslo and Prague in the interim. She got a Doctor of Philosophy from UC Berkeley in 1961. She was 91 when she passed away. The concept of representation, Pitkin described 4 types of representation: formalistic, descriptive, symbolic, and substantive. Well, that's fascinating.
Yeah,
Okay.
I really got to read this book now.
Yeah, well, I want to give you the here's the summary from Amazon. Being concerned with representation, this book is about an idea, a concept, a word. It is primarily a conceptual analysis, not a historical study of the way in which representative government has evolved, nor yet an empirical investigation of the behavior of contemporary representatives or the expectations voters have about them. Yet, altogether, this book is about a word. It is not about mere words, not merely about words. For the social philosopher, for the social scientist, words are not mere. They are the tools of his trade and a vital part of his subject matter. Since human beings are not merely political animals, but also language-using animals, their behavior is shaped by their ideas. What they do and how they do it depends on how they see themselves and their world. And this in turn depends upon the concepts through which they see. Learning what representation means and learning how to represent are intimately connected. But beyond this, the social theorist sees the world through a network of concepts. Our words define and delimit the world in important ways, and this is particularly true of the world of human and social things. For a zoologist may capture a rare specimen and simply observe it, but who can capture an instance of representation, or power, or of interest? Such things too can be observed, but the observation always presupposes at least a rudimentary conception of what representation, or power, or interest is, and what counts as representation. And it leaves off some of the other phenomenon where the other phenomenon begins. Questions about what representation is or is like are not fully separable from the question of what representation means. This book approaches the former questions by way of the latter.
I am very excited to read that. And it brings up an important thing I've been thinking about the fact that words are kind of tools. And it's been my biggest, grievance with the establishment or the people that have power or intellect and belong to these organizations, that they don't use the right words. I mentioned it, the last AEI thing that I went to, they danced around the topic of representation all day. They complained. One of the panelists, Akil, I can't remember his
Amar.
last name. Yes,
Akil
Akil
Amar.
Amar. He's written several books. Harvard professor, very very bright man, and he's proclaiming that the Constitution was a pro-slave document, and that we've overcome this, and he's very concerned that we're not going to last another 250 years. Yet he somehow doesn't talk about representation. Was it Harvey Mansfield? Is it Harvey? I'm getting his name wrong. I'm sorry. I have it notes here somewhere. Professor Mansfield said in his opening, government does not rule, it represents. It does not rule, it represents. Yet nobody talked about representation. Later, Colleen Sheeran, who has written several books on James Madison, talked about politics of public opinion, right?
Yeah.
And understanding what does the public actually want its government to be. And that is the only way to answer that is through a system of representation. Yet, nothing came up. There are lots of other parts during the panel where I kept on thinking, well, this is a perfect opportunity to talk about representation. It's a perfect opportunity to talk about the House of Representatives. And they often were talking about the things that they study. Like they're all specialists in the things that they study, which is
Yeah.
great. But where is the specialist on the thing that actually matters to people? Where is the specialist on representation? Where is the people doing this? I mean, obviously that's us. At this stage, we are it as far as I can find. I just don't think that we should be it. There should be more of us.
Yeah. Well, it's fascinating. Like, there's all these, institutes like, the Stanford Internet Observatory and the Googlia, fellowship for the study of X. But like to mind, there's not a single like center or institute with, embedded in a university that is focused on this question of representation.
Yeah.
That's
And I
that's
guess that's kind
fascinating.
of why, but I mean, to be fair, it's like we can judge everybody else for like not coming up with the thing that we came up with, but like, why didn't we come up with it sooner? Like,
Oh
why didn't
well,
we
like
start to,
it's just an opportunity. It means we get to create it, which is great.
well, and to be fair, what I will say is plenty of people have come up with this idea, right? Like we're not the first ones to talk about this or want to do this. I have met so many people over the last 4 years that have started it. I think we both have met the guy that runs 30,000.org, which is a great website on,
Yeah.
you know, the House and representation and how it was supposed to be conceived. So it's not like these people haven't existed. It's just the people that have the actual power to do something, whether with their voice or in government, aren't using the right words. We're constantly talking about democracy when we really need to be talking about representation. And I think the moment that the conversation shifts from the president and democracy to representation and your congressional representative, that's when America starts to function like America's supposed to function again.
Yeah. Well, and I just think this goes back to, at the end of the day, we've got to we've got to get this C3 spun up. That is a little bit more broadly focused on this question of representation. Like right, like it's driving us back to this question of electoral representation. And I think that us reading through this book is gonna help inform some of this, but tying it to because as I just googled like Institute for Representation to see like what showed up, and interestingly enough, there's a number of kind of like questions about like representation in the media, right? Which again goes back to this point that because Congress represents us so poorly, basically they offloaded that responsibility to media, but media was only ever meant to be a secondary source, right? Like they were supposed to represent us in a secondary sense, not in a primary sense. But making that connection, I actually think like that's the meme, right? And so this goes back to this book, right? Which is like words are so important. Totally agree, right? Like being pro-life versus anti-abortion, super important distinction, right? Means the exact same thing, but has a different valence. And today, words are important, memes are more important, and I think it goes back to what Philip Wallach said, which is there a moral imperative to go viral? And I also now am. I think initially I was like, no, which is what he thought, and now I'm like, yes, there is. Yep, nope, that is the moral imperative. And so the moral imperative is, I think it's like anytime somebody on X is complaining about the media, if instead they think this is a problem of Congress, like that means that we have succeeded, right? Like if that were to happen, like suddenly there would be money like pouring into this.
Yeah, well, and that's the shift that democracy and the presidency is all run through the media. The media
Right.
wants you to focus on those things because it makes them money, right?
Yep.
But
Yep.
you, as an average citizen, your power is found in representation. Your power is
Yeah.
found in your congressional representatives. And more to your point of what you were talking about is like the media has replaced the representatives because there aren't enough representatives. Think about the story of like my journey here. I have yet to speak with my representative, but I've managed to get published in the Hill. I've managed to meet Yuval Levin. I've managed to meet Philip Wallach. I've managed to meet a lot of different people in the media, but I can't meet my representative, right?
That's
And that's
insane.
a big problem.
Yeah. No, it's. I mean, you're so right. So, and you also, I mean, I think another interesting area of representation that the foundation is going to focus on, and I think as something that we can discuss here and now, is legal representation, right? Like another form of representation is you can go hire a lawyer, right? Like you could go sue somebody, and your lawyer acts as your representative, and often you can sue the federal government, and that is a means by which political change could be made. You can basically question whether or not Congress was acting in your best interests or unconstitutionally. And today, Trump v. CASA was decided by the Supreme Court of the United States, and this was about the Trump executive order on birthright citizenship. It appears, and I haven't read it yet, it's 119 pages.
Yeah, but those pages are, they're not that long. It's kind of like half pages. It's really like 74. What's your excuse?
Yeah. It looks like they didn't actually get to the merits. They just decided that universal injunctions or national injunctions are illegal. So we do have an important decision in this case, but we do not know what the clause of the 14th Amendment means, which is important for our movement. And so I'm just going to read the clause of the 14th Amendment so that folks are on the same page. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. So that is, I believe, that it was a question there. And why that's important is there's this question of citizenship of these individuals. And we go to Section 2 of the 14th Amendment, and it says, representatives shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers, counting the whole number of persons in each state. So it doesn't say citizens, it says persons, excluding Indians not taxed. And so, the question is, what are they going to look to as they're interpreting these provisions? Because, the interpretation, obviously, of Section 1 is going to inform Section 2. So I'm excited to dive into this case. I'm throwing in an AI right now to summarize it.
What I'll tell you is, if you really want to, when you dive into that, you need to pick up this book right here.
Okay.
America Founding Son. It's about John Bingham, and he's the one that crafted the 14th Amendment. Okay. And he was the leading charge of the 14th Amendment and when it was, and it goes through all the different variations of the 14th Amendment with the language. So it'll be really helpful to understand that story, to really craft like a real, to formulate what you believe it should be, right? If you understand who wrote it and why they wrote it and what they were trying to accomplish, I think it helps sometimes.
Okay, American Founding Son.
Yes, and he was a Madisonian thinker, although I do not believe he was as great of a thinker as Madison, which I think most people would agree, considering the fact that we all know who James Madison is, and almost nobody knows who John Bingham is.
Yeah,
And the other part of that, if you really want to understand the 14th Amendment and get deep into it, is you have to go find Roscoe Conkling's story, which is harder because I can't find an actual book. I've only been able to find a PDF book online that I've printed out and read myself. It's a biography of Conkling, but he was also instrumental in the 14th Amendment, but for different reasons.
Okay. Well, this is exciting, and it does look like the Supreme Court is going to be deciding a number of other Supreme Court decisions today, closing out their first session. And I think there's going to be a number of other important things coming down the pike. And one of the interesting things is, the Supreme Court, as far as representation goes, their representation is really pretty far removed. The judiciary, represents ideas, laws, and they're appointed. The justices in the federal court, the judges and justices in the federal court are appointed by the president of the United States with advice and consent of the Senate. So your representation there really is pretty far removed, and all the more reason for you to be seeking and desiring representation in the House of Representatives, so that if the Supreme Court makes bad law, we have a Congress to go back
I
and change it.
I'm I'm sorry. I have a real big problem with the sentence that you just said. You just said if the Supreme Court makes bad law. And I don't
Yep.
know about you, but from my interpretation, I believe Congress is responsible for making law and the Supreme Court is not. That's just my I mean,
Yeah, I mean, no, you're right. I mean, and I said that intentionally,
to
in
irritate me? No, I'm kidding.
well, yes, a little bit. So to irritate the listener, to create, you got to create a little controversy, right?
Yeah,
Um,
it's true.
you know, the Madison, Marbury versus Madison, right? Most famous Supreme Court decision. It in that decision, the Supreme Court handed the current president a loss while still saying that the Supreme Court had the authority to say what the law is. And so while you're correct, say they don't get to make new law. They do get to say if law is unconstitutional, and they also get to say what the law is. And so, for example, right, in the Obamacare case, they got to say that a penalty was a tax or that a penalty was not a tax,
Mm.
right? So, it's like yes and no, right?
Yeah.
And this is, lawyers and judges, we live in a gray area. And judges try to develop bright line rules, but often things are like multi-factor tests. It's it when you see it. It is ultimately like a gray area. And so although Congress does make the laws, Congress can't, and I don't think they should. I think if Congress tried to write laws that accounted for every possibility, they would be writing a civil code, and it would, no human being could like understand an intelligible principle. And so, what judges are doing is they're applying intelligible principles, and by doing so, often they make case law, right? And the case law basically says this is generally how we apply these intelligible principles, right? This is what the reasonable person standard means in Montana versus Wyoming versus Virginia. And so you are correct. They do not make law, but they do make case law, and the case law does inform how law is applied, and some might say that's just as important.
Well, and I think if you want to and tell me if I'm wrong here, I'm going to try to simplify what you just said. Essentially, the Supreme Court interprets the law and helps apply it so people can understand to the nuances that happen. Now, what can happen here is, let's say the Supreme Court interprets the law and Congress says, well, that's not what we meant. Congress can then write a new law, right? If the Supreme Court has judged and determined that this law means X, but Congress
Yep.
is like, well, he actually meant it to mean Y. Well, the Supreme
Yep.
Court can say, well, you should have written a better law, but this is what
Right.
you wrote. You did a bad job. Okay. And
Yep.
Congress would have to go, all right, well, let's write a new law. And Congress
Yep.
has that power. And that's
Yep.
what's really important to understand here. And I think people get lost. I mean, I've talked to actual politicians, people who are running for office. Maybe they didn't win, right? But they're looking for power, and they don't understand this. They don't understand that Congress has this type of power. They really truly believe that the Supreme Court, quote, writes the law, and once the Supreme Court decides on something, that's it. It's important to know that that's not the case.
Yep. You are absolutely spot on. You can, or the Congress can, a legislature can amend a law that a Supreme Court of the state or the U.S. Supreme Court has interpreted to say one thing, and they can say, no, actually, Supreme Court, what we really meant was this. And, so by way of example, I think Casey Maddox was talking about this, right? The TikTok ban, right? The TikTok ban says, TikTok has to divest or it's banned, and the executive branch is like, well, we're just going to extend it 90 days, and everyone's like, that's not in the law. And what the Supreme Court has said is like, well, we're deferring to the executive branch. They're the one who enforces this stuff, right? Like we can't enforce it. So the duty then is on Congress to say, okay, dear executive, if you don't enforce this law, we're going to defund, your ability to fly on Air Force One, right? Or whatever. They can use the power of the purse to essentially force action of the executive branch, or they could rewrite the law entirely to say, we're going to give, this amount of latitude and create a trigger where if the president doesn't act within 90 days, something negative from a policy perspective that the executive branch does not want will come into play.
So I agree that is a possibility. I don't agree that's what should happen specifically in this case. I think there is a different method that Congress should use that they won't use.
What is that?
It's been overused recently, or it's been in the news.
Impeachment.
They should. I mean, at the basic, your job is to execute the law as president. If Congress writes a law and you refuse to execute it, and it's not like Congress hasn't given him time to execute it. Like this is just he's just messing with Congress, saying I'm more powerful than you. And if there's anybody in Congress that has some darn balls, for crying out loud, grow up and impeach this man. Like this is the reason to impeach him. Like this is a failure to execute your job. If you owned a business and you told an employee to do something and that employee refused to do it, you would fire that guy and you would hire somebody that would do the job. He's not doing the job. He should be impeached. However, I don't think the country needs to go through that right now. I think we need to figure this out without impeachment. But, if I was Speaker of the House, I promise you I would leverage the fact that I could impeach him to get him to sign that. That's what I would do.
Yeah.
But Mike Johnson is, he's not
unfortunately, impeachment has been overused, and the House, is spineless. They really are, because they've been capped for so long.
That's true.
Yeah, it really is. No, I mean, you're not wrong. I guess what I would just say is that the other really big power that Congress has is the power of the purse strings. And in a lot of ways, I think the power of the purse strings is probably a more effective tool than impeachment, because impeachment is kind of, it's like divorce, right? It's like, it's over, right? And the power of the purse strings is much more surgical, right?
Well,
you can really push on pieces, and I think especially with Trump, because he is this cult figure who's enormously popular with the base. It's just it is going to be almost impossible to impeach him, and you could. I think that Congress, especially in this continuing resolution, right? They could have added on a rider to this continuing resolution, this budget resolution, to really say one quick thing: if you don't enforce the TikTok ban, we're taking away some important fancy thing that he really loves.
You know what I would do? I would take away the pay for all of his executive staff. His whole cabinet. I would say, hey, look, cabinet, and I would say, look, if you're not going to do this, we're going to impeach you. And if we're not going to impeach you, we're going to take away the pay for all of your staff, your 25 cabinet members or whatever number it is. And then we would go to those cabinet members and be like, you want to get paid? Well, 25th Amendment him. Get him out of there. He's not doing the job. Like, just use every tool at your disposal to make the guy do the job. That's your job. Congress is supposed to lead, not follow. And the biggest problem is Congress is following. That's why we need a different speaker. We haven't had a good Speaker of the House in, like, a long time.
Yeah. All right, Jeff, I need to get to work. I have a bunch of discovery due today, and it strikes me that when we don't have things to talk about, I think non-lawyer asking lawyer questions about like how to navigate things. Going back and forth into politics and just kind of into the mundane might be something of interest to listeners. So maybe something for us to contemplate. As always, so great to talk to you. Love to see your happy smile and hear your laugh. And I will talk to you Monday evening at 6 p.m. Mountain, 8 p.m. Eastern with our special guest, Stephen Kent. We will be doing it here live with video, and we look forward to seeing everybody there or hearing you in the chat.
Absolutely. Peace and love.
Peace and love.